Depending on where you're listening to us in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Jason Burns.
And I'm Danny Nucci, and this is the What About podcast.
Danny Nucci, I am curious what your thoughts are on your own legacy.
My own legacy? I don't know. I try not to think about it. I don't, because I don't want to think about what's going to happen when I'm done. I just want to think about what I'm doing today. More than that just friggin' overwhelms me. So I spend very little time of it. That's for other people to decide what my legacy is, if there's any. I mean, I do think about leaving a mark on this world, but it's shifted from leaving a mark that people can look back on to how am I, dealing with people today? How am I affecting people today? My children, my family, the people I talk to, is sort of where is it more than you asked for.
No, I think you sort of touched on it. You mentioned children. I feel like, if you asked us what our intentions were with legacies before being fathers, we'd probably have a different answer. But once you have kids, you sort of see yourself, what you imparted on them, in them, and that becomes the legacy in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, unlike AJ Croce, our guest today, I didn't have a famous father. I don't think you had a famous father, but I certainly was aware of the influence that my father had on other people, and they talked to me about it as a kid. And so I had that in my mind, which must be very different than, having a legendary singer-songwriter as a dad who you never really knew until, because he died when he's 2 years old. But first of all, how about this guy just as a musician? Forget even knowing that he's related to Jim Croce. I discovered him because we were going to interview him, and I was blown away by his music and his records and his songwriting and his performing and his the people that he's worked with. I mean, it's terrific stuff, man.
When you have an opportunity to see AJ Croce live, which he's on tour now doing Croce Plays Croce 50th anniversary, because it is the 50th anniversary of Jim's passing. But AJ brings it when he's playing live. So if you have the opportunity,
I'm going to use this opportunity to go. Can I get the family and friends ticket?
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Remember me? I interviewed you on the What About podcast? Oh yeah, for sure, without question. So without further ado,
let's do it.
AJ Croce.
AJ, I saw you perform Croce Plays Croce earlier this year in Rhode Island. I think it was like February, March, something like that.
Oh, yeah. And in Providence, somewhere around Providence.
And what's interesting to me is just how many younger faces I saw coming in and out of the theater. I was sitting up in the balcony. I'm curious, with so many of your father's original fans now, unfortunately nearing the ends of their life, do you feel a responsibility to sort of carry the music forward? Because, again, those original fans are probably in their 70s, 80s.
Yeah, honestly, carrying the legacy forward as far as the music goes has been part of my life for a long time. I was working behind the scenes for so many years with the publishing, and trying to make sure that the opportunities like Stranger Things and X-Men and the Fast and Furious and all of those movies and all these different places that the music was heard. And I think Stranger Things made a big impact on a younger generation.
Oh, that one was huge for sure, because it was also so prominent in the episode. It wasn't just background music. It was part of the scene.
That's
what was great for me is I really wasn't all that familiar with your music.
Mm-hmm.
And in listening to it, I discovered something, that you're a bad motherfucker, AJ. Holy shit, man. I was so impressed. I mean, it was... Obviously, I know your dad's music, but listening to you was just a revelation, man. And then I noticed that you had worked with Dan Penn.
Worked with a lot of folks, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I got my start more as a piano player. My first session when I was 17 was with Cowboy Jack Clement in Nashville, and it was like kind of a roller coaster. From there, I was opening for B.B. King, and then I was off to the races. That was when I was 18, and by the time I was halfway through that tour, I had a manager and I had an agent, and things were getting started.
But what's crazy to me, AJ, is that you mentioned those early years when you're 18 and touring with people like BB King, but
Mm-hmm.
you've always sort of reinvented yourself, at least in the studio. Your albums don't always jive with the previous version, which I think is awesome because
That's
you're
the idea.
yeah, but fans aren't always hip with that, right? They always want you to be one thing.
Some do, yeah. I think I found sort of an equilibrium with it. It took a lot of years and a lot of records, but the key to what my fans are looking for is soulful music. And I think that regardless of the genre, whether it's like a 60s pop thing, like when I say pop, I mean like Harry Nilsson or something like that, or some rootsy kind of thing that inspired by the band, or something in that world. The fans are into it, and whether it's jazz influence, blues influence, rock and roll, as long as it has a soulful influence and has a heart, then they're into it.
One of the things that Danny had mentioned to me when we chatted prior to you coming on, AJ, was just how powerful your voice was. And obviously for me, I've been listening to you for a couple of years, but Danny, can you even speak to that as your first impression of here? Because that's where, for me, where the soul comes from.
Well, it's unexpected. You kind of think, oh, maybe he sounds a little bit like his dad, and the thing that I noticed was just how friggin' versatile you are. I mean, is there anything you can't play? I mean, it was unbelievable listening to your music. I was one of my favorites was Texas Ruby. I discovered
Oh
on
yeah,
the
yeah.
early on record, and I was like, wait a minute, what is this? And such a departure from like some of your other stuff. Like I listened to a later record, I think, Just Like Medicine,
Yeah.
and I was listening to the track. I'm just go through your whole catalog here.
Uh-huh.
But this is what I love about this is discovering things that I didn't know about before, and I Couldn't Stop, and you put those two songs together. I Couldn't Stop and Texas Ruby.
Yeah, they're
Oh my
quite
God,
different.
what range you have! And was this something that developed over time, or it's just that you had a taste for all different kinds of music and had the opportunity to play it?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I've always been a fan of music. I've been a music collector. So there's a lot of different things that have inspired me. But I think if I stuck with a particular genre rigidly, I'd be bored stiff. And so by combining different elements of whether it's world music or whether it's old blues or rock and roll, or it could be any kind of thing, I find a new way of communicating the idea, and that for me is there's only so many ideas.
Well, that's an interesting segue too, AJ, because I know part of the reason for this tour is to support the definitive collection.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, knowing what you know now about writing music and being creative,
Mm-hmm.
just what that means to you to know that your dad put those two albums out and wrote so much music in such a short period of time that they could both have their 50th anniversary.
Right.
And because everything I've ever heard artists say is that you have to create a lot of crap to find the gold.
Well, he wrote and performed and even did some recordings before he found his voice. I think in 1971, the year I was born, I think he felt this urgency to start really taking this. I think he felt like he had one more chance. And so in 72, he recorded his first album, his first album where he was signed to ABC Dunhill. And then in 18 months, there were 3 albums, and tours and all of those songs. And there were some of those things that had been started had been started years earlier and were unfinished. He had this, he was just on fire. He was on a roll as a songwriter, and I think he was, growing up a lot as a person, and it shows in the music.
So have you had those moments where you are completely separate from your father, but just having those creative moments where you're feeling like you're on fire and that you could churn out the type of content that sort of defies writer's block?
I have been fortunate never to have writer's block because I do it a little every day, and it doesn't need to be good and no one needs to hear it. And I think that once you take the pressure of quality out of the equation, then it really it makes life a lot easier. But I do I do think there have been moments where I was coming up with lots of different ideas. You know, if you think about your own lives, and I think about this often, and you think about, you know, those 3 albums were recorded of my father's in 18 months. And in those 3 albums, you have a lot of similar chord changes. You have a few similar types of melodies and storylines. And the reason is because within an 18-month period of time, any of us, we sort of, even if we're incredibly diverse in our abilities and capabilities as musician or writer, composer, we tend to gravitate towards certain colors, like in a palette, like a painter would. And that's why painters have a blue period or a rose period or whatever, because just like a songwriter or musician, you're using these colors because they're attractive to you. They're inspiring to you. You can hear the influences of Jimmy Reed and you can hear the blues influences like that in Don't Mess Around with Jim, and of course, you know, Chuck Berry in some of those character songs like Rapid Roy. But what you really get in a lot of the character songs, and what you can really hear as an influence, was Lieber and Stoller, if you're familiar with them. Now they wrote a ton of hits.
Hound Dog.
They wrote Hound Dog. They wrote a million songs for the Coasters and the Drifters and the Platters and Big Mama Thornton, of course, and Elvis. They wrote Kansas City. They wrote these character songs like Charlie Brown or Little Egypt that were really influential to my father. Because, you know, he was listening to that stuff in the 50s.
And his first album with your mother was more in that realm, right? More like doo-wop.
It was not. No, it was really a folk album, more in the, you know, Ian and Sylvia world of duet albums, and I think, you know, he was. Still hadn't really found his voice. I think Time in a Bottle was the epiphany. I listened to the recording, the original recordings of that while he's writing it.
On what did he record on?
Well, at that point he was switching between an old woolen sack, reel to reel, a little portable reel to reel player, 1/4 inch.
So he had a little studio.
Not a studio. You wouldn't know this was the kitchen table if you call that a studio. So it was the woolen sack came with its own little mic. And then after that, you know, he got one of those Sony, little Sony tape recorders. It wasn't so little back then, but it was, you know, you put a cassette in it.
Sure.
And so it was one of those first cassette recorders, and that made life a lot easier. And certainly he traveled with that towards the end, but I think it was, you know, you can hear those influences. And then
can you hear him working it out in those recordings?
Yeah, absolutely. He's playing one verse at a time. So he plays one verse and then it stops. And then it comes back and it's another verse. So while you're listening to it, you're hearing the song come together, and it's almost exactly like the record, except in, you know, pieces. It's amazing how much of it was like, once he had the idea of it, it was there.
And it's amazing that once it got to a record deal and a producer and an A&R guy, that it still turned out to be the original vision.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think it was hard to argue whether, you know, with that, but, you know, almost every single major label turned it down. They turned down, and that album, the demos of that album, of him playing those songs, some of them alone, some of them with Maury Muehlhausen, who was his accompanist, are are so great, and it sounds so much like what the record was going to be, that the songs are so strong on that first album. It's hard to believe anyone would turn it down. Don't Mess Around with Jim and Operator, New York's Not My Home, and Time in a Bottle, and just so much that was good about that first album, Box Number 10, and Tomorrow's Going to Be a Brighter Day. It's just a great first album. And so, I think you do, of course, hear the progress, and with different songs as he was writing that first album and second album, which he wrote most of the first and second album at the same time. And some of the songs got carried over into the second album, like Leroy Brown.
Let me ask you this: at what point? I'm changing gears here because it's so wonderful to hear your passion and your love for your father's music.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, given being a young man and trying to sort of make your own name and make your own mark, at what point, and do you remember at what point it sort of turned on you where you thought, all right, let me delve into this and maybe play some of these songs, or maybe, add these to my set, that sort of thing?
It took a long time. It took a long time for a lot of for different reasons. One, initially, I didn't think there was any integrity in me doing it. I felt like I should do my own stuff. I should make a name for myself. I shouldn't use his name or his music to get notoriety. I just didn't think that was cool. And so,
well, you didn't need it.
Well, it was, but still people think you do, and people think you use it. And so you can't escape the outward perspective of it. So I loved working behind the scenes because I felt like I could really contribute something on the publishing side, and be really helpful in keeping his legacy alive while, being able to do my own music at the same time. So it was, there were a few different factors, and it happened really organically, man. The way that it occurred was that I guess in my early 30s, I was archiving one of his work tapes, and it was a tape from the late 60s, and he was practicing what he was going to play at a little club that weekend, and so he would practice and he would record to hear what he was going to sound like, so it was this one particular tape where all of these songs that I had played since I was like 13, 14 years old. Old Fats Waller, Bessie Smith, Pink Anderson. There was a Jimmy Rogers song.
So he was doing covers. He was practicing the covers.
Yeah, it was all covers.
Got it.
It was all, and they were the same covers that I had played on the piano, not on the guitar, but realized we had this deep connection. And his record collection was hugely influential to me, but these songs were not in that collection.
I was going to ask you about this. Sorry to interrupt. I don't mean to kind of cross you, but I'm just fascinated how you discovered that same kind of music. I mean, we're the same age.
Yeah.
These were not the prevalent artists that I was listening to as a teenager. How did was it the record collection that influenced you in that way? Because obviously your music is so soulful and coming from, you've got that Dr. John New Orleans kind of feel to it.
That was part of it. Well, Ray Charles was my gateway drug.
What a nice gateway drug. We should all be addicted.
It's easy to find, and it's cheap. It's really cheap. But I'd lost my sight as a kid. And so I was turned on to Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder, and, listening to Ray Charles and then going through the liner notes and learning about Charles Brown and learning about Nat Cole Trio and learning about the old boogie guys and jazz influenced, folks and gospel artists that influenced Ray as well. So there was a great little record shop in San Diego where I lived. And it's called Folk Arts Rare Records. And I started collecting old records and old 78s and finding that old rock and roll and R&B and listening to Little Richard on a 78 on Specialty Records was so profound because it was so much more punk rock than the Sex Pistols or the Clash or anything, because nothing had ever sounded like this. Nothing ever jumped off of wax like this. It was so powerful and so different, and I was glued to it, you know.
So in essence, you and your dad came to the same music on your own, and
Yeah,
so when you're
naturally.
listening. Sorry, and I want to come
Yeah.
back to the story because you're listening to these tapes, right?
Yeah.
And it's obviously the same music that's influenced you.
Mm-hmm.
And he's practicing this, getting ready for the show.
Yeah. And I got chills because these were the same songs, and these were obscure things. Like, he had Fats Waller in the collection, but it was Ain't Misbehavin' and Honeysuckle Rose. The song he played was You're Not the Only Oyster in the Stew, which was something I auditioned for Columbia Records with when I was 18 years old.
So you just discovered that it was one of his go-tos as it was one of yours, and completely unrelated?
Wow.
Totally unrelated.
That's outstanding.
Never heard him do it. So I realized we had a musical connection that was deeper.
What about legacy?
Back to the story. So listening to that tape of my father's, it was around that time I picked up guitar. So I was in my 30s when I picked up guitar, and I really wanted to use it as a...
You never had a chance to pick it up in a studio while people were messing around or in downtime?
Yeah, I had, but
you did it with that purpose to kind of learn to play those songs?
Yeah. I was
that songs on the guitar?
Yeah, in my early 30s, my mom gave me a guitar that was my father's, that he wrote those first two albums on. And so I felt an obligation not only to learn guitar, but also to learn his songs. And as a piano player, all those years, playing fingerstyle came pretty naturally. So that's kind of where it started. And
there's something kind of fascinating about that, AJ, in terms of like that guitar getting those chords again. You know, there's something really nice, and like giving that guitar life, and you know, I can just see the guitar smile to feel those chords again.
It was spooky.
Yeah.
It gives you chills.
How did it sound? Was great guitar? Was it a Gibson?
It's a 1933 Gibson L00. Absolutely wonderful instrument. I've used it on many recordings. I don't take it out of the house except to go to the studio. Otherwise, it's in my room. But it's an amazing guitar. If I could find another one just like it to take on the road, I would. But that one stays at home. And
everyone wants to. Isn't that funny? Everyone wants to. One to save just in case.
Yeah. Well, one that was my dad's and one that's mine, I think is the way I was thinking of it.
Yeah. Sure.
But anyway, so it was those combination. I'd been asked to play his stuff since I was 16, and offered a lot of money to do it. I just didn't think it was right. But once I saw these connections between his stuff and where his the chords he was writing were going and where he got them from, and that they were from a similar place as where I had borrowed and been inspired by it, there was a deeper connection. And so I'd throw a song of his in to my set for the fun of it, and I saw the reaction of the audience was so powerful, and people were so moved by it that I couldn't believe how it felt. So when about 10 years ago, when he would have turned 70 in January of 2013, I did a show to celebrate what would have been his birthday, and had a bunch of friends come in, musicians, and sit in, sing a song. I sang a bunch of songs, and the reaction was amazing. And I kind of put it aside, and I thought, well, this could be really fun, but I couldn't imagine just performing his music as like a cover band. I would lose my grip. It's one thing to do it for a night, another thing to take it on
maybe
tour.
A yearly event.
Yeah.
Sure.
And then about 5 after, I thought about it, and it sort of developed. I'd throw a song in here or there into my sets, and then About 5 years ago, I guess it was 2019, I did the first Croce Plays Croce, and the way that the show really came about is so much the way that I organically came to his music as a performer. Of course, I was always connected to it as a person, as a son, but by having his music be the focus and then my music and the music that really connected us, by being able to use those songs that connected us, and there were thousands of them, part of his collection, part of his record collection that I grew up with, that I could draw from. I knew that as long as, if his songs were in there and I could play some of the deep cuts that meant something to me, as well as some of the hits, if I could put some of my stuff that was really resonated with those songs and where they came from, they had similar roots, then it started to just feel right.
Well, what I loved about seeing you, AJ, was because I saw you a couple months ago, and I think you've even mentioned this in some of the press for the tour. But you go in expecting one thing, you're expecting to tap a toe, but no, you're dancing, you're tapping every toe you got, because you're still you. That's the best part of it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It is really. I know that people come in feeling expecting to, have something, and it is, you do get the nostalgia and the videos and all of those things play a big role in it, but it's I think it's the combination, it's the stories, it's finding out where that stuff came from, both musically and from the stories that I tell of where he was inspired by it.
Well, every episode we do a special subject, AJ. This one is about legacy, and Danny told me that I had to bring something up today because I'm having an interesting day, and I think it ties to our conversation. Is that after our conversation, I'm moving my father to a assisted living home, and I spent all morning putting his stuff into a dumpster because he can no longer live on his own, and so I feel weirdly connected to this conversation in a way that I didn't expect to.
Yes.
And when you brought up the guitar, your dad's guitar, I thought it is interesting how we assign stuff to that relationship.
Well, I think it depends on the individual. It depends on who that person is. It depends who we are. It depends on where we are in our life. There's so much that varies. I think with my father, it was a unique thing because he died when I was very young, but he never really left me. His music is present. It's on the radio all the time. His you can see reruns of things he was on, and there were tapes around the house of his, so I could hear his conversations with friends, and there was a legacy truly that existed after he died. I don't think he could have known what that was. He was 30 years old. Do
you think he appreciated who he was and what he contributed?
I think he realized at the end that I think he felt a sense of self-worth that he probably hadn't. He'd gone to college. He was the first in his family, an Italian family, first generation, to be going to college and to get his master's and all of that, and then not to use that and to, maybe blow that up, those opportunities to follow his heart and his dreams was incredibly risky. And his parents were not, real fond of the idea. And I think it for him, his father died right before the first album, You Don't Mess Around, Jim, came out, but he had heard it, and his father, my grandfather, heard this album and was proud of his son. He was proud of my father, and he said, "I think you've got something here, Jim." And I think that was for him the beginning of it. But he was really figuring out who he was because he was still a young man.
I have a question. Have you run into other people like, I don't know, like the Sean Lennons of the world that have a similar experience to you? Have you spoken to them about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know Sean Lennon, but Teddy Richards and I met. Teddy is Aretha's son, and I went on tour with her for a short period of time, and he was the guitar player, so we got to know each other, and are still good friends. Kathy Guthrie, Amy and Paula Nelson, who are Willie's daughters, are friends of mine, and I've known for a long time. I think it's different when your famous relative is alive in some ways. These I didn't meet these people when I was a kid. I met them, and once I was an adult. There wasn't really that many people I could talk to about this. And honestly, even touring the way that I did and the people I played with, I felt like I had to be cautious about what I said and who I told, because I didn't live in LA. I didn't live in New York or Nashville. It was not a music center. And so I felt like the people around me, if I said I'm on the road, I was playing with James Brown the other night, and he called me into his dressing room. We had this conversation. People would be, think I'm dropping names. It's not for real. But when it's part of your life, and that actually happened, you want to tell someone, like, yeah, I walked into James Brown's dressing room and he was under a salon dryer in his underwear. Like, you're going, holy Jesus Christ, what did I just see? And had this full conversation about Little Willie John and all of these things. Anyway, it was it was like that for me. So when I did meet these folks who have had all different kinds of lives, and in some ways in the shadow of renown, I think everyone deals with it in a different way, and certainly if your parent is still alive and you live with it that way, then it's much different than my experience, because he had passed away so long ago.
In terms of your, I don't know, your experience with getting to talk to people who have a very specific vision or experience of your father's legacy,
Mm-hmm.
how's it different from yours, or are there parallels?
I think there's parallels. I think that for the people that knew my father in his life and knew him during that time, whether it was his manager, my mother, my relatives, his relatives and cousins, and I think that for them, it seemed like it all just happened so fast. I think, it was such a short period of time. Again, 18 months is really fast, and you might feel like it's not, but when you take a look at different things that happen in your life in 18 months, just think of the last 18 months.
Just the fact that there's 3 records in 18 months is just blows my friggin' mind.
Well,
But wait, no, let me rephrase. Good records.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that wasn't uncommon back then. People did two albums a year back then. And there wasn't you didn't have the same kind of media saturation as you do now. And it wasn't quite the same. So it was important to do that. But starting in the 70s, people started spreading them out a little further apart. And I think he was just about to enjoy the possibility of being able to do that a little bit.
AJ, when you close the fallboard on your piano for the last time, what do you want your legacy to be? Like, what do you hope that others look to you for in the future?
I think there'll come a time when people, will, there'll be a new generation that hears me and sees me even playing some of these songs and go, yeah, I've read about his father. I heard about his father, but aren't very familiar with him. I think that because I've had the opportunity to practice and work in so many genres as a piano player, it's much broader musically. Better, probably not, but broader certainly. And I think as a musician that hopefully people love it. Hopefully it outlasts me. That's the goal of music. Is, you know, I've spent my life trying to write and perform timeless music, so that when you hear it, you don't know when it was from, and that's the beauty of great music, regardless of when it was recorded.
And great producers. I mean, you've worked with great producers because just listening, I mean, they're gorgeous tracks, man.
Oh, thank
Like
you.
really inspired, gorgeous tracks. We have a sorry, Jason. We have an audience question that I haven't asked you before we go. I want to make sure I ask
Yeah,
you.
of course.
Audience question. This is from Sandra P.
Okay, Sandra.
And Sandra wants to know, you can hear how you're being impacted your dad's music because he writes about you in his lyrics. Are those songs you inspired him to write mean something special to you? I think it's self
Of course,
answers itself.
it is.
Yes.
Of course, yeah, of course. But and you know, "Time in a Bottle" was really hard to sing for me for a long time. It was probably the last big song of his that I put into a set or threw in to a set anywhere, because it was emotional for me. So um, once I once I approached it from another angle, it was different. It's also kind of interesting. One of the reasons I never I didn't play his music growing up, was that I was a piano player. And as a piano player, this music was not really challenging. I would play through it. "Time in a Bottle" was easy to play on piano, really simple. But when I picked up guitar, it had this deeper meaning, and it was a lot harder. And you see the chords, playing those chords, and playing that song in general is just so much more challenging on that instrument. And it gave me a newfound respect for him as a player, but also I think the difficulty of it, technically, in little parts of it, made it even more ominous, because, you know, it felt like this. It scared the hell out of me, you know, because it was emotional. So there was this emotional connection, but then there was also the technical aspect of it, of these stretches that I was going to have to do on the guitar while I'm playing these parts, and then and then I've got to keep it together, you know. So yeah.
Wow, dude. That dude is something else, man. You know, his passion for music, you can tell he's like a cat.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? He's like, hey man. Like like he could have like, hey man, you know, like back in the day we was playing with you know.
I know. I actually found myself using the term hip. I said hip.
It's so funny. He's such a cat. Like, yeah, so I was playing with Etta James and BB King. I mean, Aretha Franklin. Listen to the people that he just threw out. Like, yeah, I played with them for a
I
while.
know. And to have a famous father, and then he's touring with these huge stars, musicians at 18 years old. I mean, we talk about legacy with his dad, but he has been around legacy his whole life.
Yeah, and one of the advantages that I think he's had in his life is he walks in as Jim Croce's son, but he leaves as AJ Croce, bad motherfucker.
Which I will say, in first person experience, I entered his Croce Plays Croce show going to listen to Jim Croce songs, and
Sure.
left an AJ Croce fan. Yeah.
And I hope that's the experience that everybody has, or at least they listen to this and they go visit his music on whatever platform they use, and realize that this guy on his own is a hell of a musician and a songwriter, and you know, just like his dad. Um, but it was just great listening to him. You can see that there was a turn. I thought what was really fascinating was the fact that, you know, behind the scenes, he felt the same sort of love and compassion for his father. But in terms of performing the songs or being involved in the songs, there was this hesitation, which I thought he stated, you know, did come out organically. It happened organically that he started playing his dad's songs.
And you going back to our discussion that you and I had at the start of this podcast, Danny, the amazing thing about legacy for me, what we give to our kids, is that my 6-year-old daughter can sing the lyrics to every Jim Croce song. So what we impart on them goes beyond what we ever think we would leave. So legacy goes on.
It's basically what they see, what they absorb.
Thank God they have such amazing dads in you and I, right?
Yeah. Well, you obviously haven't talked to them about it. I'm sure that's the perspective you and I have. Anyway, all right, bud. Well, this was great. I look forward to the next one. And everyone, thanks for listening.
Music by Denny Nucci. Produced and edited by the same two people you heard hosting this show because they have no friends.